Hello and welcome back to JAAM, and today I am playing some more Kerbal space program. So last week we managed to get a satellite into orbit around the planet Kerbal, which I was very proud of because it's the first time I've managed to get anything into orbit in Kerbal space program. Today I am being a bit more ambitious than just a satellite in space. I am aiming at getting a successful landing on the moon today. And I'm going to do things slightly differently. I'm recording my voice now after the gameplay has happened, so I've done this before, I already know what happens in this recording, and I will talk you through the stages of how it went. Okay, so here I am at the launch stage, and I went for a rocket that had a big amount of thrust at the bottom, and then a smaller rocket on top. And the idea that I was going with was to get the smaller rocket into an orbit around Kerbal, so that I could then use all of the power of the smaller rocket to catapult me towards the moon and make a successful landing. Now, this rocket was quite good. I managed to get a nice angle on it. It was really sturdy, but I was having some problems with gaining enough altitude, or my game seemed to tell me I had a different amount of altitude than I wanted. You'll see that coming up in a moment. And that made that really hard to figure out when I needed to make my manoeuvre to be able to get a successful, nice orbit around Kerbal. Once I'd gained a considerable amount of height, I decided to cut off the engines and then try to adjust the flight of my spaceship in order to be able to make an orbit. But the way that the rocket had taken off meant that the orbit was really weird, and I was having to play with all the different things to be able to make a successful orbit. And it ended up being a rather sort of oval and egg-shaped orbit, very much like my very first one in the last episode. And I believe that is because I was accelerating too much. So I was accelerating further away from Kerbal than I needed to, but not far enough to, not at the right angle, so that I was not making an orbit. I was sort of going up and coming down, and then when I got to the top point, I'd have to adjust to make the orbit. So that's why it would be so egg-shaped, because you had to push yourself further away, because when you span round, it came back, and otherwise you'd be hitting into Kerbal. So I did my adjustments and slowly got myself into position to make my burn, and then I think I just did my burn because that was the right time. I ran out of fuel in my main compartment, and then I had to use the smaller rocket, which is what I didn't want to do. So I'd already discovered that I didn't have enough fuel to be able to make the orbit through the main container, which is something that if I make future versions of the Mooner, I will address, because it's apparent that I need more fuel to be able to get that rocket into a sustainable orbit. I carried on with my burn until I got a sustainable orbit that I could then line up with the moon. This did, however, use up a lot of my fuel, and I wasn't too happy about that, because I really wanted to keep all of the fuel in that rocket to be able to get a successful approach to the moon. I had various other attempts before this, and I was having a problem where my rocket wouldn't go in the direction that I wanted it to, and I was doing an orbit around the poles rather than around the equator, which is really difficult if you want to go to the moon, because then I had to try to figure out how to line that up, and I couldn't do that. As you can see here, the blue line is slowly increasing, but so is my fuel. It's really dropping. And this is where I was starting to get worried about the successfulness of this flight. I'd used up so much fuel just trying to get a orbit, and I wasn't even really able to get anywhere towards the moon. I'd got a nice orbit at, I say nice, I've got an orbit where I was at around about 80, and I'd run out of fuel again in my other two rockets. So now I was relying on this tiny rocket to get me to the moon. What I then did was try to figure out at what point would be best to add a maneuver to get to the moon, and apparently that wasn't. That would give me a nice escape orbit, which is not what I was going for. I don't know why it suddenly set that off, but I removed that maneuver, and then I added another one. I found that I had multiple maneuvers on my line, and I had to get rid of them because they were going to cause problems with my aiming. So I set off with trying to figure out what I actually need to do in order to get to the moon. I adjusted my settings on my maneuver to be able to get to a point where I was really close to the moon. So my closest approach would be within distance, be able to make another maneuver to create an orbit around the moon and then to intersect and to land on the moon. So I adjusted the settings that I had until I got to a point where I would make a moon encounter. I was hoping that I'd have enough fuel in my tiny rocket in order to be able to get there, and I've really struggled to figure out how I was going to successfully do this. I had my eyes set, and I had to do a full orbit of Kerbal before I could even get to the point where I would be doing my maneuver. I then set myself up, got to the point where I needed to on the nav ball, so I'd be aiming towards my target for my maneuver, and then I fast forwarded through time to get towards T. As I began to approach T, I made sure that everything was in line and that I was ready to make the final burn that would send me on my course towards the moon. Now, I had a T of only 20 something seconds, so I was really hopeful that my liquid fueler would get me to where I needed it to go. It was not what I was hoping for, but I was going to head towards the moon. As I began my burn, the sun arose, and I kept watching my blue marker, my blue line of travel, so that I would know if I was going to get towards the point where I would touch the moon. Going through this, I was very nervous that I was going to run out of fuel before I even got to the point where I would have a encounter with the moon. But slowly but surely, my burn and my line of travel got to the point where I needed it to be, and I still had a smidging of fuel left, which meant I could make a maneuver when I was by the moon. I was then hoping that I would have just enough fuel to slow me down and be able to land on the moon. Now Bill knew that there was a chance that he would not return from the moon, and it was very apparent now that this would be the case. So I fast forwarded time a lot to the point where I almost intersected with the moon because I wanted to make another maneuver. As I started to approach the moon, I pressed something and I wasn't quite sure what happened, and it really changed my direction of travel into a straight line over to there. I'm not sure how this happened or why, but apparently I changed something. So at this point, I decided that I would try and do another maneuver to bring me back towards the moon and to take me towards where I needed to go. I had adjusted this so that I was going to make a collision with the moon and would be able to make a landing. And then, yes, I'd forgotten a key element to my spaceship. Two key things that I required that I didn't have. I had no power. I had fuel, but I had no power. I had no batteries or no solar panels. And at this point it struck me. I'd really annoyed myself that I'd got this close to being on the moon, only to mess it up by fundamentally forgetting a very important part of the rocket. I was annoyed. I wanted to get to the moon. I was close. I could have done it. I know it probably wouldn't have been the easiest of landings, but I would have had that opportunity. So, next week I'm going to have made the adjustments to my rocket ship that will get me to the moon. I'm going to get there. Bill, he will not. He will float in space forever. But the next brave Kerbal that steps in our spaceships, he will get there. Thank you very much for watching. This has been JAAM. If you like, please leave a like, give us a nice big thumbs up. If you haven't already, please subscribe because it helps out a lot. And I will see you in the next episode of whatever we make. Goodbye. And okay, now it's going sideways. Oh my, okay, it's like I messed that up. God damn it, machine.